Fellow members of the Historical Society and guests, good evening. My subject, the folk of North Terrace, gave me altogether too much scope. I've decided to talk about that period that as a child I referred to as the olden days, and to ignore the governors and whose appointments and achievements are well documented, and talk mainly about those other peoples. I'll begin at the western end, as Adelaide did, not because Colonel Light began his survey for the proposed city at that end, when there was no western end, but because the village that grew to be Adelaide began there, close to the water of the Torrens, and where eventually the road from Port Adelaide, or Port Misery, came to the new town. The activities of the people covered most trades and callings, so together the colonists started to establish a little piece of their homeland in a new and very different environment. Martha Berkeley has left us a picture of how this area looked within 3 years of the first settlers coming ashore in summer heat in their totally unsuitable English clothes. Martha had married Captain Berkeley in England in 1836, and they arrived in South Australia with her sister Teresa on the John Rennick in 1837. This was the 13th ship to arrive from England. Although Martha and Teresa were born in England, they had spent their teenage years in France. Their father was English and their mother French. The girls were educated at home by a tutor, who also taught them drawing and watercolour and miniature painting. Both were artistic and developed their skills. Aged 24 when she arrived in the colony, Martha was receptive to her new surroundings and captured the scene with charming naivety and competent perspective. Her 1839 view of North Terrace shows the early Holy Trinity Church and the already developing western end of North Terrace. The men in the foreground are dressed fashionably as if they were in London or Paris. Martha received many commissions while she was in Adelaide. She did studies first, then the patrons commissioned the final work for which she was paid. Martha and Captain Berkeley were well received in the new Adelaide society. They dined at Government House and attended social occasions. Teresa Chauncey, the more flighty sister, became well known in Adelaide for her wax portrait medallions that she did of local citizens. Teresa married John Walker and lived at Swanscombe at Walkerville. Just 14 years after Adelaide was settled, Victoria discovered gold, and about 1,500 men left for the Victorian gold rush in 1851. The streets of Adelaide were deserted. Many houses were abandoned by their tenants, and the property became unmarketable, and a general arrest was put on all business. The people in the streets were mainly women and children, and all this put an enormous strain on the economy of South Australia. Now, this is going to be a real balancing act, because I have to be here to talk and there to change the slides, so I'm just going to run up and down. The railway came to North Terrace next, and in 1856 was the opening of the province's first steam railway between Adelaide and the port. In 1857 we had a railway to Gawler, and then by 1860 to Kapunda. 1877 the railway extended north from Port Augusta. In 1880 the first train from North Terrace to Glenelg. From 1886 the railway to Bordertown. In 1887 to Mount Gambier, to 1888 to Broken Hill. So by this time we have a good railway system. What has this to do with the folk of North Terrace, you may well ask? Well, more people were more mobile, more places to stay were needed. They needed more hotels, more boarding houses, more wood choppers for the steam trains, more houses, more engineers, guards, train drivers and others associated with railway maintenance, more food and clothing, more bootmakers, many more labourers needed, goods yards, storage yards and transport. Those trains really changed Adelaide. The tradesmen who lived at the western end near the railway yards reflected this change because they were suddenly getting different trades coming in. But they still needed the livery stables and coaches and carts and horses to hire. George Mills built 3 two-storey terrace houses and a larger house for himself in one continuous row just east of Fen Place. Now, Fen Place is down the western end where the new university is being built. The house that's coloured on the top of the slide is the house that is coloured on the bottom of the slide, just to show you where it is. And of course that shows those the railway yards as well. These buildings still stand but are now on the corner, as the old corner house was demolished for widening Fen Place. George began as a shoemaker in Hindley Street in 1840. He saw the opportunities in providing transport between Adelaide and the port, and eventually became a carrier himself, besides providing horses for hire. George Mills was a partner in the firm of J.R. Fuller and Co., who managed the goods traffic on the port line and had horses stabled at the limits of the railway lines at Gawler and Kapunda. Between 1871 and 1882, he was a member of the coaching and carrying firm John Hill and Co. Here we are loading up the coach. One of Mill's 3 houses next to his own was run as a boarding house by Thomas and Louisa Morris. Gradually they expanded into the next house of the row and ran a much enlarged boarding house by 1885. Eventually the whole group of 3 Mills buildings was run as the Victoria Coffee Palace by Louisa Morris. By this time we don't seem to have Thomas, so I think Thomas must have departed. At the time, the Coffee Palace was defined as an inexpensive, unlicensed accommodation of a standard between a boarding house and a hotel. In 1914, Louisa's Coffee Palace closed and it's now a nightclub. This is an added complication. Would you like to have it? It's just that I don't have enough hands. I hope you're thinking of North Terrace as a place where there is nothing except what you see on the slides. Just ignore all the things that are there now. Holy Trinity. The Reverend Charles Beaumont Howard, the Reverend James Farrell and the Reverend Richardson Reed, all Irishmen, were the first 3 clergy at Holy Trinity on the corner of Morford Street. We all know of Reverend Howard's problems with no church, having to rig a spare sail for shelter to hold the early services, and the young couple who were married in the church without a roof. However, it's the 3rd colonial chaplain, Reverend Richardson Reed, who did so much to improve the simple stone church of 1838. This is the way it was in 1838. Then you all know what it looks like now, so there's no point in showing you that. It was during his 43-year term that the major rebuilding took place, designed by E.J. Woods and built by John White. In 1888, the walls of the church were raised and buttressed, and the roof given a steeper pitch. You can tell it's different, it's a different proportion altogether. The tower was almost doubled in height and buttressed to the top of the previous wall. Gothic detailing was added to the bell tower, and the whole topped with 4 pinnacles and trefoil decoration around the top. Box pews replaced the row pews. I think they've changed them back again now. He also installed the beautiful timbered ceiling. Reverend Richardson Reed married a daughter of Dr. George Mayo. Dr. Mayo had married Maria Gandhi, the companion of Colonel Light. This is working on to something. It was the Mayo family who gave the self-portrait of Colonel Light to the art gallery. Do you all know that unfinished one, where there's a painting, he's painted it one way on the, and then not liked what he was doing, so he turned the whole thing upside down and started again. So there's a ghost picture of Colonel Light at the bottom, just ahead, and then there's the rest of the painting. I think he died before he finished it. There's some interesting housing for you. John Ransford, a wealthy coaching proprietor, had this 2-storey terrace built in the busy and fast-developing business end of North Terrace in 1875. John had come to Adelaide in 1839 with his parents when he was 3 years old. As well as developing the lucrative transport business, Ransford had pastoral interests and was also a member of Parliament. I believe he liked horses too. John Ransford constructed the southern section of the Overland Telegraph from Port Augusta using 106 horse teams, 100 bullock teams and 100 camels, and was involved in carting most of the materials for constructing the remainder of the line, one of the biggest public works of the 19th century in Australia. These terrace houses all became boarding houses as the demand for accommodation grew, with labourers arriving by the shipload and the new railway system requiring labour on North Terrace. As most people arriving from overseas did not have their own transport, coaching and carrying were 2 of the main requirements. Another pair of houses built by John Ransford were next to the Trinity Church parsonage, but more upmarket than the previous terrace. These houses had semi-basements, which were cool rooms in the summer. They made it even cooler if they thought to put them on the south side of the house. They were all facing on the north, which rather tickled my fancy. Much more sophisticated were the houses he built for his own growing family. A large 2-storey house in Hutt Street, now the Naval, Military and Air Force Club, and Ochil Tree House on East Terrace. It's right on the corner of East Terrace and South Terrace, a very frilly house now. John Ransford married 4 times. First he met Emma, I'm only remarking on this because I thought it was a bit of a remarkable story. First he married Emma Hart, aged 17, in 1857. She died in 1876, having had 5 children. The next year he married Eliza Hart, aged 36, who was the younger sister of his late wife. 4 years later she died, having had no children, but had no doubt been caring for her sister's 5. 4 years later she died, having had no children, but she had no doubt been caring for the children, for the sisters. In December that year, 1881, he married Elizabeth Coombs, aged 25. She had 3 children and died in 1886. Now he had 8 children. He needed another wife. The next year he married Sarah Coombs, who was the younger sister of his late wife. So you're beginning to get the idea. Aged 28, and they had 4 children. This explains why he built those enormous houses. I wonder how many servants he had to look after, 2 adults and 12 children. This hotel was built on the corner of North Terrace and Blythe Street in 1877, known as the City Temperance Hotel. It was built in bluestone and 3 stories high, with 2 cantilevered balconies across the front. Can you see how there are no veranda supports on those balconies? They're completely clear of the footpath. In 1890 it was known as Grayson's Coffee Palace, and eventually West Coffee House and Federal Coffee Palace. It was demolished in 1918 for building the Grosvenor Hotel. Is it helpful if I tell you what's there now, so you know where it is? Okay, well, if I remember, I'll try to tell you where things are then. Lawrence Grayson was the manager of the Union Engineering Company, which was next door to the City Temperance Hotel. Grayson was a member of Stowe Church and extremely involved with the Sunday School. A new building was constructed in Halifax Street to cope with the number of children. Part of the popularity of the Sunday School was attributed to Grayson. Under his leadership, this is a quote, it grew in strength until by 1890 it had 23 teachers and 477 children. The Bank of South Australia, the 3 men who I was going to talk about the 3 men who transformed the bank into a first-class hotel and the woman who kept it there. Henry True, George Flecker and E. Alexander, who doesn't seem to have a Christian name, and of course Mrs. O'Brien. She's a bit out of the period, but I thought she had to come into it anyway. Henry True was the man who first changed the bank into a hotel. The Bank of South Australia was built in 1838 and survived the financial crisis of 1852, but by the 1870s was in decline and was taken over by the Union Bank of Australia Limited. In January, Henry True commissioned Roland Rees to design alterations to the old bank and turn it into a hotel. And then there's a lovely piece from the Register, which I thought I'd read you because it says, in 1879, a small paragraph in the South Australian Register alerted the citizens of Adelaide to a new hotel. The South Australian Club Hotel, North Terrace. Henry True, late proprietor of the Globe Hotel, apprises his friends and the public that he has become the lessee of these magnificent buildings known as the Bank of South Australia, North Terrace, which he's converted into a grand hotel. The rooms are on a scale of magnitude hitherto unknown in the colonies and comprise numerous large parlours, dining rooms, ensuite, upwards of 30 bedrooms, lofty, airy and comfortable, the largest bar rooms in the colonies. Gentlemen visiting the metropolis will find the spacious grounds attached to the hotel very convenient. The stabling accommodation is very superior and will be fit to cope with any exigency. Henry True, proprietor. It was so popular he built 30 more bedrooms, and this hotel, of course, was right opposite the railway station, so he's getting all the business. The hotel was also known as the South Australian Club Hotel. This new hotel attracted the wealthy squatters, but continued to be a family hotel. In the 1880s, a new proprietor took over the hotel, George Flecker, who commissioned Alfred Wells to transform the building by putting a 2-story stone facade on the front. It was beginning to be a luxury hotel. In 1894, a new front entrance transformed the North Terrace frontage. There was a large garden on the western side. The third transformation was when E. Alexander, the third lessee, took over the South Australian in 1899. The new 3-story facade was built with wide, airy balconies running across the frontage to North Terrace on 2 floors. Alexander made the South Australian the most well-appointed and luxurious hotel in South Australia, and it was well patronised by interstate and local people. Alexander also owned the Largs Pier Hotel. Guests could share their holiday between the South Australian Hotel and the Largs Pier. He was quite happy for them to spend half their time at one and then spend the other half of the holiday at the other. And I think he charged them 10 shillings a day, whichever the one they were at. I wonder if any of you remember Mrs. O'Brien, who so successfully kept the South as an elegant place to go for so many years. If you do, you'll probably also remember Louis Cotton, the head waiter with an attitude. He was always very formal and almost better dressed than the guests in his dining room. He was a stickler for the dress code in his domain. Men had to wear ties and jackets even for breakfast. There was none of that neat casual dress that gets us by today. No thongs and no tats. Why, Louis would have had apoplexy at the thought of it. Mrs. O'Brien's family always came down to dinner, with Louis showing them to their table. During the war, an American colonel wanted to take over the whole of the South for his headquarters and for his staff. Mrs. O'Brien insisted on keeping some parts for her regular guests and won. The South lasted nearly 100 years under the management of 4 folk of North Terrace. At the corner of Gresham Street and North Terrace, and immediately west of the Bank of South Australia, you know where Gresham Street is? It's behind where the Gresham Hotel used to be, before they knocked that down too. Daniel Garlick designed the new premises for Johnson's Pantheon Boot Factory. This building was to replace the old factory in King William Street, which was considered too valuable a site for a boot factory. What do you think of this as a site for a boot factory? It's right now the Terrace Hotel. You can you imagine a more valuable site than right opposite Parliament House on North Terrace? Perfect place for a factory. Daniel Garlick was an architect of great influence on North Terrace, and he's going to get a mention here. The present Newmarket Hotel was built for Mrs. Frances Badman in 1883 to replace the Newmarket Inn, which had been built in 1847. That was the most westerly building. He built that with 3 stories. It's a very elegant building even now, and it was to cater for the tastes of the better classes. It's still an elegant building. The Gresham Hotel was stylistically his, and I think it was built by Garlick, but that's gone too. And Dr. Phillips' house, which you'll see directly, is another building by Garlick, and the G&R Wills warehouses are another lot that are still there that are built by Daniel Garlick. I think there are several architects who had fingers in the pie all the way down North Terrace, either together or working separately. Another person who I associate with the terrace is S.T. Gill, the artist. Samuel Thomas Gill's contribution to Adelaide, including North Terrace, was his careful observation of the built environment in the 1840s and the wonderful record his watercolour paintings have given us of the first few years of the fledgling city. From the painting we not only know what was built on these original town acres, but also the materials used in their construction. Not so much in this particular painting, but in a lot of them where he shows the brick construction, and you can pick what the materials were in the paintings. I didn't choose a particularly good example. He recorded the business names clearly in the paintings, and the pictures are all clearly labelled as North Terrace looking south, and the simple watercolour sketch of the temporary post office at opposite Government House, which also says where it is. This one. I can't think of any other way of doing this except by this little piecemeal handful bit. This is Henry Watts' post office. In 1839, Henry Watts was living in a small house on the corner of North Terrace and King William Street, opposite Government House, where Westpac is now. This is that little house. The governor appointed him Postmaster General at a salary of £100 per annum. Adelaide had no post office building at the time, so it was suggested that as his own house was so centrally located, that Watts build an addition to it for use as a post office, which could be either paid for by the government or rented by them from Henry Watts. At this time, the charge for overseas letters, irrespective of weight, was a penny. The money was paid to the ship's captain who conveyed them. The Watts house. Henry Watts remained Postmaster General until 1841, when his brother John replaced him. By now the remuneration had rocketed to £200 a year. Previously, people had been in the habit of calling on the postmaster at any hour to leave or receive mail. Captain John Watts was extremely unpopular when he stated that in future the post office would be open between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m, and that was final. Actually, he said say 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. to start with, but he came down at 6 p.m. eventually. There were 2 letter carriers employed in the whole city of Adelaide, one delivered to the east of King William Street, the other to the west. The North Adelaide residents had to come to get their letters from the Watts post office. I find this particularly interesting painting of S.T. Gill's. It is right opposite Government House. The building on the extreme right is the Watts post office. The building next to it is where the Adelaide Club is now. The thatched cottage next to that is Dr. Phillips' house. Then there are 3 houses which was very soon knocked down and something else put in their place, and the other one is the South Australian Company building. We're really racing down the terrace, aren't we? The thatched cottage I always pointed out is in this one. There's the Adelaide Club and the thatched cottage just next to it. That is Dr. James Phillips' house. He lived here for many years in this thatched-roofed wooden cottage next to the land on which the Adelaide Club was built in 1864. Of course, the thatched cottage was there much before that. In fact, this high fire risk neighbour made the rate of the club's fire insurance premium on its new building greater than it otherwise would have been. In 1869, Dr. Phillips replaced the cottage with a large two-storied house built in a classical French style with a mansard roof. It had wide colonial verandas. In 1889, Quiz reported, Dr. James Phillips is, with the exception of his former partner, Dr. Mayo, the oldest practitioner in Adelaide. I don't know how he liked that. In S.T. Gill's painting of North Terrace in the 1850s, Dr. Phillips' house is clearly seen in the middle. Do you remember the one cottage that was thatched? With that house, it wouldn't matter much which way around you put it, would you? It's absolutely regular, except that is the Adelaide Club next to it, that big black wall. Next door lived the Goss family. These are very grand houses. Dr. William Goss was born in Newfoundland and as a child came to England with his parents who settled in Poole. After school years he began his professional training with Mr. Salter in Poole and later at Guy's Hospital in London under Mr. Morgan, who was married to William's sister. So they were keeping it in the family. William spent time helping in the collection of specimens for the naturalist Philip Goss, as he too was interested in natural history. William set up in practice at Hoddesdon in Hertfordshire, where he married Agnes Grant, and where all the children, 3 daughters and 4 sons, were born. He was advised to come to a warmer climate because of his bronchitis. He went to Melbourne, but moved the next week to Adelaide. Didn't say a word. In 1851, gold fever struck, and Dr. William went to the diggings in Victoria, but he soon came back. From 1853 to 7, he was a colonial surgeon, having the supervision of the hospital, the lunatic asylum, and the jail, in partnership with Dr. Bayer until 1866, and then with Dr. Whittle until 1873, when his youngest son, Dr. Charles Goss, returned from England and joined his father on North Terrace. Although heavily involved with professional obligations, he attended all public meetings. His advice was much sought on medical as well as community subjects. As a private gentleman, he was universally esteemed. His first daughter, Agnes Grant, married Alexander Hay, and his third son married a daughter of Alexander Hay. Can you work that one up? The relationships get very complicated. William Christie Goss, the second son of Dr. William Goss, was the explorer, and he was the one that married the daughter of Alexander Hay. He showed an early aptitude for drawing and trained as a surveyor in the Surveyor General's office, where as a cadet he did a survey of the far north. In 1872, he was selected as a leader to explore the southwest of central Mount Sturt and to endeavour to reach Perth. It's a roundabout way, isn't it? In 1873, he left Alice Springs in April, returned in December, but he didn't reach Perth. He did a detailed account of 60,000 square miles of unknown territory and discovered an extraordinary rock. By naming it after Henry Ayres, Goss gave the Ayres name international exposure, to an extent Henry himself could never have believed. People who've never been to Australia all know about Ayres Rock. I wonder if he should have called it Goss Rock, after his own pioneering family. William Christie Goss described the area around the rock as a series of aboriginal campsites, with the natives using the many caves in the rock for shelters. He was highly regarded for his skills and abilities, which had led to such responsibilities being placed on such a young man. He suffered from ill health for some years, but he died at 38. 38 was not a good age in the Goss family. Dr. Charles Goss, the youngest son of Dr. William Goss, was from an early age known for his gentleness and engaging manner. Destined for the medical profession, he was sent to England as a very young man and studied in London and Aberdeen, especially interested in diseases of the eye. In 1876, he was appointed the honorary medical officer at the Adelaide Hospital when his father resigned, and then the honorary ophthalmic surgeon for 5 years. At the hospital, he endeared himself to the patients by his constant kindness and attention. He seems to have been a very nice young man, to both in and out patients, and his skillful treatment. Dr. Charles Goss did not take an active part in public matters due to his busy life as a medical man. He enjoyed playing cricket and was an excellent speaker at literary association meetings. In 1844, he opened the Goss Wing at the Home for Incurables, an institution that he and his father, Dr. William Goss, had been greatly involved in assisting. Young Dr. Goss was involved in an accident in Hutt Street when the horses bolted and the coachman lost control of the carriage and it overturned on the footpath. The back wheels came off the coach as the springs were broken. His little daughter he saved from injury, but in doing so his leg became jammed and badly fractured. He was taken to the house on North Terrace. This happened on a Saturday, I think, and attended by leading doctors in the city. Wonder they didn't take him to the Adelaide Hospital, wasn't it? Anyway, his leg was carefully set, and 2 days later they found he had gangrene, so they amputated his leg and he died that night. And he was 38 too. It was a terrible thing to happen. He was a man with great promise. This section of North Terrace became the Harley Street of Adelaide, when in the early morning rows of carriages were drawn up in front of the many doctors' houses lining North Terrace. The carriages waited to take the doctors on their rounds and hospital visits. In 1876, I found this little snippet about how somebody saw the scene in Adelaide. As they enjoyed the world's goods, most of the doctors had handsome private residences on North Terrace, close to their consulting rooms, or in nearby North Adelaide, and regarding themselves as gentlemen, they wore frock coats and silk hats. Their medical knowledge was small, but already vastly larger than their colleagues who had been trained prior to the 1850s. Instruments were carried in their pockets of their coats or in their top hats, since they did not yet know that infection could be carried by their own hands and instruments. Forceps string and presently carbolic ointment were considered adequate preparation for a delivery. Dr. Thomas Corley lived in the two-storey house on the corner of Stephen's Place and North Terrace. It's the tallest one on the right-hand side of the picture. There are two other buildings in front of it. The property was owned by the South Australian Company, who owned that whole block. And the company building was on the left and on the eastern side of the block. That's where Gawler Chambers was built later on. We're into that block now. There had been a house on the western half-acre since 1845. Francis Hardy Faulding, F.H. Faulding, the manufacturing chemist, lived here about 1860. Dr. Thomas Corley bought the land from the South Australian Company in 1897 and built the house. 6 years later, he sold it back to them and rented it until 1906. Dr. Corley was said to be a genial, kindly, courteous and talented gentleman. He was an honorary surgeon at the Orphans' Home, an honorary surgeon at the Children's Hospital, and at the Retreat for Fallen Women. Mrs. Corley was elegant in the social scene. I know nothing more of her except that how wonderful she looked in a black velvet gown with a train at an evening party. Dr. Corley died in 1906. In 1909, the house was let to the recently formed Queen Adelaide Club. In 1914, a new building adjoining the club rooms was built and let as doctors' rooms. Later, a third building joined the two and to the west of the North Terrace frontage, also for doctors' rooms. They're quite different styles, three different buildings. Eventually, the Queen Adelaide Club bought all three buildings from the South Australian Company and redeveloped them to form the composite building that forms the club today. If you can ignore in the bottom photograph there, the Gawler Chambers, which is rising high, and imagine this was the building that adjoined those other buildings in Dr. Corley's day, it gives you more the scale of the streetscape. It must be lovely to have gardens like that along North Terrace. This is the sublime to the ridiculous, isn't it? Look at that tiny house. And that survived for a long time. That house belonged to William Ross Sawers. The land on which this cottage was built belonged to the Sawers family since 1837, and the house was built soon after. William Sawers was a brewery manager and probably lived in this house for the whole of his life. He may have been born there in 1839, soon after his parents built it. He married in 1870 in Adelaide and had one son, who predeceased him, as did Emily, his wife. William died in 1911. The cottage was demolished in 1926. In 1928, Lister House was built on the site, so that puts you on the right spot on the terrace. Some of these houses you might even remember. I certainly remember some of them. I'm a very old lady. This is where John Martin's men's store is now. 207 North Terrace. It was originally the home of Heinrich Ludwig Voss, who was a painter and glazier. Voss had a second story added in 1879, and after 1886 Sir Joseph Vercoe bought the house and added a side porch to it. Well, I'll tell you about Heinrich. Heinrich was born in Hanover in 1812. His father was poor and moved to a village near Hamburg when his son was still young. Aged 12, Heinrich had to work for his living with farmers nearby. At 15, he became apprenticed to a carpenter. After many years, he accumulated enough money to begin his own business in Hamburg as a builder. He was very successful until 1848, when the business was destroyed by the disturbances and revolutions in Germany. He was young and strong and decided to go to South Australia with his wife and two sons, so he could earn money to pay his creditors in Germany. He arrived in January 1849. When gold was discovered in Victoria, he went to the diggings, and he had some success. He returned to Adelaide and rented premises in Rundle Street and built up the well-known business of H.L. Voss, painter and glazier. By 1860, he was able to send a friend in Germany the money to repay all the creditors in full with an interest of 10%. Heinrich went on in business to become an extremely rich man. His son William joined his father in the business. At the time of his death in 1886, it was recorded. There were quite a lot of things said about him. I think you might as well hear them all. Mr. H.L. Voss attained his success largely by his sterling character and straightforwardness as a businessman. He was one of the few men against whom no one could say an evil word. This, combined with great good judgment and carefulness in expenditure, brought its results. In his private capacity, he was a gentleman in the truest sense of the word. He was liberal to a fault, and many hundreds of people have been helped by him, unknown to outsiders. He disliked to be thanked, or what he did being known. There was nothing he disliked more than fuss. For any kindness shown him, he never forgot to be thankful. He was a quiet, unassuming citizen, devoting himself to business, and although he kept aloof from active political work, he was a close observer of the course of events and a shrewd reasoner. He was of a charitable disposition, but avoided ostentatious benevolence. He was the last of the Voss family, his wife and younger son having died some years ago, and his older son more recently. To his employees, he was more like a father than a master, an upright, kind, and generous man. For many years he has suffered intense pain from a neuralgic affection, but was always the kind, genial old Voss. So there are a lot of people that had a lot to say, good things to say about him. Well, this, of course, happens when people die, because you very rarely get anything nasty in an obituary, do you? His funeral procession from his home at North Terrace consisted of 46 carriages. The deceased employees followed in 8 wagonettes. His estate was £155,591, pounds that was, a lot of money in 1886. He bequeathed £10,000 to each of his stepchildren and to each of his cousins in Germany. I don't know how many cousins he had in Germany, and then large amounts to friends and charities in Germany, America, and Australia. He listed it down to so many £100 to so-and-so's wife. The deceased friends' wives were remembered. It was quite extraordinary, the people that he listed on that. And of course it was all in the paper for us all to read. I wonder how Voss would have felt about that. He was not that kind of person, was he? Chalmers Church, as it was when it was built, on the corner of Pulteney and North Terrace. The Reverend John Gardiner was sent to South Australia to establish the Free Church of Scotland in South Australia in 1850. In 1851, this church, known at the time as Chalmers Church, was opened. That's 1 year. The Reverend Gardiner and his parishioners had raised the money by voluntary subscription and had it built in 1 year. Of course, he had some fairly well-off parishioners. That must have helped. The South Australian Register of the 5th of July 1851 was scathing about the architecture. At the time, the tower was unfinished and the battlements were not yet on the top of the side walls, as they are not there. If the building do look wrong in this picture, I must admit. But now it is finished, and people shouldn't see things half done. They couldn't afford to do any more, I suppose. Somebody with the incredible name of Shepherd Mayfield came to the colony in 1849. I told you some of these people wouldn't be terribly well known. Anyway, Shepherd Mayfield came to the colony in 1849 and started in business as a cabinet maker in Grenfell Street. 1851 he went to the Victorian goldfields, but soon came back and set up in Rundle Street as a cabinet maker and undertaker. I think he could see that the undertaking was a good line. He was a genial man, and he brought up the undertaking to a well-known business. Shepherd and his wife Anna lived on North Terrace in a 2-storey house near the corner of Elder Street, just a little to the west of Chalmers Church. They both lived there until 1883, when Shepherd died, and Anna continued to live there until 1894. Like many widowed ladies, she took in boarders. There must have been hundreds of people living on North Terrace in these days, because almost every house seemed to be a boarding house. I just put this one in. It's just 1 acre, acre 25, on the corner of Pulteney Street and North Terrace, where the Capita building is now. It's called something else now. I put it in to show the haphazard nature of development in the days before the City Council required plans to be lodged and permission granted before building started. There were certainly a lot of folk of North Terrace on this acre. There were 5 2-storey terrace houses, which is the one that you can see on the top. And they are the ones, 5 2-storey terrace houses and 24 cottages on this 1874 plan. The occupations of the heads of the houses were given as 2 laundresses, a cigar manufacturer, a printer, shoemaker, agent, French polisher, 5 labourers, a painter, a tailor, a bootmaker, a nurse, a blacksmith, a boot closer, don't know what that is, a carpenter, and 2 married or widowed ladies who didn't say. Those numbers didn't include wives or other dependents, and they must have had children as well. If each little house had an average of 2 people living in it, this area had 58 people on the acre. This seems an interesting comparison to the acre next to it, number 26, which we know belonged to the Hunt's family, and probably had the parents, one son and a servant or two. This is one you all know. William McMean's claim to North Terrace is through his architecture, either on his own or in association with other architects he was involved with on many North Terrace buildings. McMean was associated with the design for the Jervois wing of the public library, now the Mortlock. The design for the original building at the University of Adelaide was attributed to McMean, but may have had some input from another source. Known as the Michell Building, his version of the neo-Gothic style remains almost as he built it in 1879-80. William McMean and his brother Gilbert, a surveyor, were both on the survey team for the Overland Telegraph. Upon his return, William was working closely with Daniel Garlick on several projects, so that they had a lot of buildings being built all the way down North Terrace that were either Garlick or McMean or Garlick and McMean, so that there was a great crossover here, I think, of who was helping who with which building. They both worked on the designs for Prince Alfred College, this building, and in the 1870s it saw William supervising several buildings on North Terrace and others in the city. He was the architect for 261 North Terrace, with its second empire facade and classical western elevation. When it was built, this house overlooked George Hunts's large garden to the west. Most rooms have windows onto the west to take advantage of the view, which is now the site of Freemasons Hall. The Malcolm Reid Building and Hotel in Rundle Street East, the Queen's Chambers in Perry Street, the Crown and Sceptre Hotel in King William Street, the original Children's Hospital building, and several houses in North Adelaide were built to his design, as was the Supreme Court in Victoria Square. He designed Marble Hill, the Governor's summer residence at Mount Lofty. His brilliant career was cut short when William McMean died, aged 40. This is a McMean house too. Arthur Waterhouse was a financier, as was his father Thomas Greaves Waterhouse. Arthur built 261 North Terrace on land belonging to his father, who had returned to England to live. The land had been mortgaged to Thomas Greaves Waterhouse in 1864, and in 1866 it passed to him for the consideration of 5 shillings. It's doubtful if Arthur Waterhouse ever lived in the house, which was finished in 1881. He married Laura Morgan, Sir William Morgan's daughter, and went overseas. Arthur built a mansion for his own use at Pennington Terrace, North Adelaide, in 1883, now known as Hawker House, where he and Laura lived until 1888. In 1889, Arthur had built an even grander house in Broome Place known as St Margaret's. That was the Cancer Association, I think, Anti-Cancer Association. Arthur Waterhouse's father, Thomas Greaves Waterhouse, was one of the early benefactors of PAC. As well as giving generous gifts to establish the school and to enlarge it from time to time, T.G. Waterhouse interviewed prospective headmasters and staff for the college when he was visiting England, and again when he returned to England to live later in life. One of the houses at PAC is named Waterhouse House in honour of T.G. Waterhouse. It's a coincidence that my husband Raymond was captain of that house when I first knew him, and now we live in a house built by that same family. Do you remember the exhibition building? That dates us, doesn't it? This was built to celebrate the colony's 50th birthday. It had an exhibition from June 1887 to January 1888. The exhibition was opened by His Excellency Sir William Robinson on June the 21st, the Jubilee of Queen Victoria's accession in 1837. It was in this building that the celebrations to mark these occasions were held, which included musical occasions. Herr Karl Putman, conductor and violinist, had a distinguished musical career in Adelaide. I just have a sec. He was the third son of Herman Putman, a renowned poet, editor and art critic who settled in Melbourne, where he resumed his journalistic career. Karl Putman, the musician, came to Adelaide in 1865 with the Leicester Opera Company, went on their grand tour through New Zealand and Australia. Karl Putman established himself in Adelaide as a teacher of the piano, violin and singing. A year after he arrived in Adelaide, he married Marie Lossell, the daughter of Karl Lossell, and his wife Marie at Woodside. In 1867, Karl was elected conductor of the Adelaide Liedertafel, a society which is probably the oldest in the state and holds an honoured place among musical institutions. For some years, Karl Putman lived in a house on the corner of Stevens Place and North Terrace, where Dr. Crawley later built his house. He also lived on South Terrace for a time. In 1887, he was on North Terrace again. He and Marie and his family of 6 children, ranging in age at that time from 22 years down to young Otto, who was 7, and Karl Putman had many private students, but was also music master at PAC. He was in charge of the large musical concerts at the Jubilee Exhibition Building in 1887, as well as
in 1887. He was living at 261 North Terrace. Everybody's lived at 261 North Terrace, but it's been there a long time, which is why. That year, which must have been inconvenient for all those rehearsals he had to attend and the performances across the terrace at the exhibition building. The children of Carl and Marie Putman were musical, and some played tiny violins at an early age. Their eldest daughter, Francisca, was a brilliant musician and a pupil of her father. She won a scholarship to the Royal College of Music in London, being one of the first in piano and selected for final decision out of 35 candidates. She was not allowed to take up her scholarship because her parents thought she was too young. Francisca also passed the university matriculation examinations and did her Mus Bac under Professor Ives at the Conservatorium of Music. Francisca was not allowed to perform for money, but she did play privately at Torrens Park for the Bar-Smith family, and on other occasions her father permitted it. She married a Mr. Kelly and went to live at McLaren Vale and died aged 38 years in 1905. People died terribly young, didn't they? That's just to show you how it was with just the exhibition building and the Order Hall, the Conservatorium building. I don't think the Conservatorium building was built in Professor Ives' time. I think he was had finished by then. He was the professor that taught Francisca. When he was appointed Professor of Music for South Australia, Joshua Ives visited music schools and universities to observe the latest teaching methods in England so he could introduce similar systems in Adelaide. Professor Ives gained much local support by giving lectures on music and weekly organ recitals to the delight of the audience. He was small and dapper and sported a green jacket, I read somewhere. In 1885 it was said that the advent of Professor Ives may be regarded as inaugurating a new era in music in the Antipodes. Also, it may not be out of place to remark that the University of Adelaide was the first to have a professor of music, and that its example is now being followed by most cities in neighbouring colonies. Very patronising. Professor Ives had another passion, trading shares at the stock exchange. He was seen almost daily at the exchange. And sometimes incurred the wrath of members by being slow in settling a claim. In 1892, the exchange voted against Ives becoming an exchange hall member, but approved it in the following year. He grew rich in 1896 with the Western Australian gold boom. He was still a vestibule trader in 1899 when rumours arose about his financial position. A year later, Ives was declared a defaulter and suspended. The older conservatorium was by now worried about their professor of music. They wanted him out. In December 1901, at the university commemoration ceremony, he unexpectedly stood up at the end, and had the last word. He disparaged the conduct of the Chancellor and the Vice-Chancellor, explained why he was leaving, and left. Keep getting this 261 North Terrace, don't we? Richard Michell, the first director of the Adelaide Zoological Gardens, was the eighth son of a Church of England minister in Cork, Ireland, who took his family to New Zealand after leaving the family estate in Ireland. That seems logical, doesn't it? You get one in the army, one in the church, when you have a big family, and the oldest son gets the estate in Ireland. For some years, Richard Michell was at Mr. Christopher Baggett's station near Kapunda. Then he was a clerk of the court at Bacchus Marsh in Victoria. Back in South Australia, he contracted with the government for the preparation of certificates of title and plans. He was one of the first to suggest an acclimatisation society to collect birds and animals. Eventually the collection grew to such an extent that Michell resigned from the government service and devoted his time entirely to the society on a regular basis. He was also a well-loved drawing master at Prince Alfred College. We keep getting back to that too. Michell visited Japan and the East for specimens. He had a knack for getting donations from people, both in cash and kind. The King of Siam gave him some magnificent specimens. The year he returned from overseas, he occupied 261 North Terrace while the new zoo director's house was being built. Once again, this house was in a convenient place for Michell to live while overseeing the zoo and the residents. The house was finished in 1899. Michell was admired for the pride he took in the zoo for the pleasure of citizens and visitors. Adelaide was famous for its beautiful and splendidly maintained zoological gardens. They were quite early too. I think there are very few other cities that had them. You're down to Frome Street. Are your legs tired, or do you think you can make it to East Terrace? This house was built by Dr. Robert Waters Moore, and it was called Frome House, and nobody thought to photograph it until they were pulling it down. It was on the corner of North Terrace and Tavistock Street. Tavistock Street is now Frome Street. He was born in Cork in Ireland, where he also did his medical degree. Almost immediately he came to Sydney as a medical officer on an immigrant ship, not just a free passage but paid to come. He came out to South Australia and started practice at the Borough. This mining town was the fastest growing town in the colony. Dr. Moore had a genial manner and was well loved in the town. In 1850 he moved to Adelaide and stayed at Miss Bathgate's boarding house. That's where Foy and Gibson's used to be, and it's our car park. When he came to Adelaide, he followed Dr. William Goss as colonial surgeon. This also included the positions of superintendent of the lunatic asylum, president of the medical board, and member of the vaccine board. He was paid £500 a year and forage for one horse. Dr. Moore was in private practice at his home, where he also saw out patients. He then sent them across the road to the Adelaide Hospital dispensary to get their medicine, which was right opposite his house. Frome House was a large two-storey building with wide verandas which looked straight down the avenue of Frome Road. When Tavistock Street was widened, Frome House was sacrificed for the good of the traffic. It was at this time that it was renamed Frome Street. Dr. Moore took a great interest in literary matters and had a library that was regarded as one of the best in the colony. He was a clever botanist and for many years acted as a judge at horticultural and floricultural shows. Dr. Moore, however, was a veritable dictator at the Adelaide Hospital. It was he who admitted the patients, if poor enough. Their financial state was inquired into with a probing worthy of a tax assessor, I read. He was the one who discharged them when cured or otherwise, or if they misbehaved. He performed operations and disdained consultation with other doctors, and he lacked tact, and others were not looking for his company. He died in December 1884 with a long cortege from his home on North Terrace. The governor sent his carriage. Governor couldn't come, but he sent the carriage, and 26 doctors were at the funeral. Robert, is this normal to send your carriage?
Yes.
It is. Now, quite natural to send your carriage with the blinds half drawn. I thought that was rather killing. I wondered why... I didn't mean that. I shouldn't relax, should I? Samuel Tomkinson, J.P., also lived in Frome House. He was born in Wales. He was the son of a grocer, apprenticed at 12 for 7 years to an East Indian merchant in Liverpool. From 1836 to 1850 he was employed in the North and South Wales Bank, and in 1850 emigrated to Sydney to the Bank of Australasia, and he was transferred eventually to the Adelaide branch. Now we've got him here. He succeeded the previous manager, who was Marshall McDermott, and the next year he married his daughter Louisa. During the 1851 gold rush, not only men but the coinage left the state, and Samuel Tomkinson, F.H. Dutton and Neville Baggett rode overland to the goldfields of Ballarat and Bendigo to examine the situation. He was opposed to the 1852 Parliamentary Act to accept Victorian gold as legal tender at £3 11 shillings an ounce, because it was contrary to the currency laws of the British Empire. His bank refused to accept gold nuggets as legal tender, which didn't do the bank any good. He was very active in public life on the Adelaide City Council, the Volunteers, the Licensing Board, the Education Board, the Chamber of Commerce, the Board of the Borough Mines, the Anglican Synod, the Society for the Blind, and a visitor at the Lunatic Asylum. If this wasn't enough, upon retiring from the bank in 1879, he entered Parliament and fought his last election at the age of 81. Isn't it nice to see it without the tall buildings? Although of a slightly later era, Walter Harvey Baggett deserves mention as a long-time resident of North Terrace. He too lived at 261 North Terrace. It sounds as if we're taking borders, doesn't it? For about 20 years before moving to the family home, Nurney House at North Adelaide. Walter Baggett's encyclopedic knowledge of building and architectural history enabled him to design buildings for Adelaide with a great sense of presence, but at all times having regard for the appropriateness of a style for the purpose of the building. His lasting contribution to the North Terrace streetscape is the Great Hall of the University of Adelaide, Bonython Hall, named for Sir John Langdon Bonython, who gave the money to build it. On a prominent site facing down Pulteney Street, I think that was stipulated in the agreement. Walter Baggett designed this building in the spirit of ancient halls of British universities as a grand setting for ceremonial occasions. That's why it has a sloping floor, so you can't dance in it. I think the site was controversial at the time because it did, of course, ruin any north-south access through the city. Not many more. William Brewster lived in a tiny cottage on a 20-foot frontage between Pulteney Street and Frome Street from 1860 until 1879. He was a gardener. From from J. Escort Hughes' A History of the Adelaide Hospital, I learned that a Mrs. Eliza Brewster was the first nursing sister to graduate from the hospital and who, in 1867, became the matron, a post she held for 21 years. I could find no connection between the two except the unusual spelling of Brewster, which was Bruister. They came to Adelaide on 2 ships 3 years apart. I wanted to prove that they lived together in that tiny cottage on North Terrace, close to the hospital and the gardens, but my search was leading nowhere. Then I wondered if they died together. A visit to the computer at the West Terrace Cemetery soon led me to a grave with a headstone that definitely linked Eliza with William. A later reference to a William Brewster, overseer to Robert Bath Smith, had me puzzled. I wondered if William had gone bush for some time. All was disclosed when some years later I read Pamela Oborne's History of the Torrens Park. I found that our William was overseeing the building alterations at Torrens Park. I thought he was out in the country. While the Bath Smith family were overseas for a year or so, holidaying and buying some new furnishing for their soon-to-be-ready mansion in Adelaide. I don't have an old picture of this. I'm sorry that one, the house on the left is the one we're going to talk about, Dr. John Fisher's house, and it had verandas on both floors. And there's one picture I've seen of it, and it just doesn't reproduce well enough to be able to bring it tonight. John Fisher arrived in South Australia in 1851. He practiced at Salisbury and was medical officer at the Mano Para District Council and Yatala Prison. He practiced medicine on North Terrace for 3 years, and in 1836 he was the surgeon for Wallaroo Mines at Kadina. He died in 1879. Now a bit about the buildings. John Fisher built these 2 houses in 1872, but only lived there until 1874. It had a basement, pantry, cellar, summer living rooms. On the ground floor, 2 formal living rooms overlooking the terrace and a back courtyard garden, and on the first floor, bedrooms, bathroom and kitchen. Not very convenient by modern standards. I wouldn't have wanted my pantry in the cellar and my kitchen on the first floor. This building was probably the earliest built with consulting rooms for a doctor. An arched corridor led between the 2 houses and gave access through to the doctor's rooms at the back. It's still there, so you can inspect this feature from the street. The wide verandas on both floors have been removed. Another interesting person who lived in that house, although it's very hard to find out anything about him, was the Chinese specialist Dr. Lam Yao. He lived in Dr. Fisher's building from 1909 to 1934. His wife was Eleonora Clarissa, but I have no further information about her. An elderly man who came to speak to me when I was watering the garden one day said he'd lived in Tavistock Street as a child and told me that his mother was the laundress for Dr. Lum during the 1930s. He also said that each autumn his family used to gather new dry leaves from the plane trees in Frome Road to fill their palliases. So that's how you got by when the times were tough. I'll give you that to look at while I talk about something else. Because I don't have a picture of the something else. Can any of you remember on the corner of Frome Street an unfinished building that was there for some years with walls up about 5 feet and a lot of weeds around it? Because well, I'll tell you about that. It starts with an old man living near Hobart on a large estate who took a fancy to a poor, bright, frank, curly-headed young boy who lived nearby. His name was Paul Joseph. When the lad grew up, the old man offered him a partnership in his business as an orchardist. Young Paul declined as he was determined to become a missionary. He came to Parkin College and was one of the first students. The old man occasionally sent him pocket money. During his studentship, Paul heard that the old man was ill, so he borrowed money to go to Tasmania. Some time later, the old man died. Paul wondered if he would get a small legacy, but was amazed to find that he was to inherit the whole estate. The deceased had only one living relative, a brother, who was a rich man himself. The details are unknown, but included 80,000 acres of good land, and the estate was said to run into 5 figures. The Reverend Paul Joseph had accepted the pastorate of Hindmarsh Square Congregational Church, the one that was the ABC. Do you remember the Pepper Pot Church in Hindmarsh Square? With an ebbing congregation, the property was valuable, but the upkeep was a financial problem. He planned to sell the Hindmarsh Square Church with his legacy, and with his legacy build a new city temple and mission on North Terrace. He was to have complete control over and responsibility for the enterprise, expected to cost £10,000. He also bought the late Sir Samuel Way's home, Montefiore, for £6,000. The Reverend Paul Joseph obtained finance on the church's deeds and went ahead with the building in 1916. After 6 months, the the bank could not trace the rich man, so they stopped the finance and seized the foundations and the land. And that's how it stayed until 1938. 1938 to 1950, it just stood there with weeds growing around it. Paul Joseph enlisted in the army in 1917 and was killed in France. The Christian Scientist Church bought the land in 1938 and didn't do anything about it, and they built the building that you see there now in the 1950s. But that's a very strange story, isn't it? One doesn't know who to blame for what, or even what was wrong. It just didn't seem to work out. This house that you're looking at now is 175 North Terrace, which was built to the design of Thomas English. And Thomas English, Thomas Elder, and other members of Chalmers Church, now Scots Church, built the house and gave it to the church to use as a manse. The Reverend David Patent occupied the house during his ministry from the time it was built until 1901. The present minister of Scots Church, who's done a great deal to restore the church to its former beauty, would really have enjoyed this house as a challenge. Too late. It was built by the Ministry of Works and demolished in 1972, and they widened Frome Street. Do you know where that is? That's the corner of Frome Road and North Terrace, and it's the corner of the old Adelaide Hospital. The building, the small building with the chimney on the top, is the Gate Lodge, and the other is the dispensary where Dr. Moore used to send his patients across from his house to get their medicine. This is James Hanson, who was the Adelaide Hospital gardener. He lived in that little house with the chimney on top, which was near the corner of Frome Road, and it was the only resident. He's the only resident I have that was on that side. Late in the last century, before the new buildings encroached on the area on the North Terrace boundary, the hospital buildings were set well back, with well-kept lawns and flower beds and trees. It was James Hanson's job to tend these gardens, which he must have done with great skill and enthusiasm, as he had colourful displays of flowers bordering the carriageway from the entrance gates to the big courtyard framed by the hospital buildings. The newspaper recorded in 1895, "Thanks to the gardener James Hanson, the grounds are beautiful to look upon. Indeed, the visitors have oft-times entered the hospital plantations, mistaking them for the botanical gardens." Having seen the size of the Gate Lodge, this next photograph might surprise you. That's taken outside the front door of the Gate Lodge, which of course that door is inside the grounds, and it was taken the year before James Hanson died with his wife and 10 children. Where would you put 10 children in that house? One can only hope the older ones were moving out by the time the younger ones were coming on. Don't you love the piles with the potted palms and the tea table and the pot, and only one of them's got a cup of tea? James died in 1901. At the time of his death, he held the record of being the longest-serving officer or employee of the Adelaide Hospital. Unfortunately, I don't have an old picture of Ayres House. If it was an old picture, it would have blinds at the shutters at the windows, and a very fussy and elaborate garden full of pampas grass and Moreton Bay figs. Does anyone remember the Moreton Bay figs out the front? Yes, I remember those very well. Never called Ayres House in Sir Henry's time, nor Austral House, simply North Terrace. Henry Ayres was not a highly educated man, but he was shrewd and forceful. He went to school in Portsea in England, and then entered a legal office in Portsea. At 19, he married Anne Potts, who was 27, and within a month had emigrated as a carpenter with 3 passages for both of them. I told you he was resourceful. He arrived in 1841 and worked as a law clerk in James Hertel Fisher's office. In 1845, he was appointed the Secretary of the South Australian Mining Association, and it was a case of being in the right place at the right time, I think. Its copper mines yielded 15 dividends of 200% each in the next 5 years. Ayres had bought 45 of the original £5 shares, and by 1850 controlled sufficient votes of absentee shareholders to be elected managing director of the association. He acted as agent for some investors, lending their money out at 10% and investing in land and other mines. In 1857, he entered Parliament at the time the youngest elected member. He was 36. His career in Parliament and 7 times as Premier is well documented. The cottage Henry Ayres leased from the chemist William Paxton was enlarged as the Ayres family grew in size and importance until the state dining room and the ballroom were added, and the Kingston-designed porches at each end gave 2 separate entrances. So if you asked for dinner, you went to one and to a ball the other, I guess. I'm written here, remember the Moreton Bay fig trees? As Sir Henry Ayres by now, he entertained lavishly in the house which he had eventually bought from Paxton. He actually didn't own the house. Paxton still owned it, but heirs kept building onto it, and eventually Paxton sold it to him. Paxton lived in England. I might mention Bridget Galvin. Bridget Galvin was Henry Eyre's housekeeper. This was for Walter Harvey Baggett, who also lived at 261 North Terrace at one stage. Oh yes, I mentioned him before. And this is something he reminisced about. Grandpapa's house was always known to us simply as North Terrace. From my earliest recollection, he lived alone there until his death in 1897. Grandmama had died in my infancy, and the household deity was Bridget Galvin, the perfect housekeeper, with a complete knowledge of her place towards the family. She was hard and prim for strangers, but she had a soft spot for us, for whom lemonade and gingerbread and nuts were always made available. The house was large and echoed with every footstep in its still emptiness. It had been full of gaiety, for Grandpapa had loved to entertain and always enjoyed his own dances, which he gave annually. Indeed, the large corridors and suites of rooms opened with folding doors were built for company. And then he talks about the family coming for lunch. And there was one lovely bit here. He said, "I don't remember the old man ever taking the least notice of me. And I was too young to attend the converse of the elders, but I do remember that the food was unusually good." And then he mentions Bridget again. There were also on his birthday gatherings of the family numbering over 30, with 19 of us grandchildren seated in the larger dining room. These were field days for Bridget, who must have enjoyed the chance of showing the daughters of the house what could be done, with ample stores of silver glass and linen, quite apart from the culinary arts. I'd like to have known Bridget. We're nearly there. The Botanic Hotel, built by Richard Vaughan. He began in business at the east end of Rundle Street. In 1862, he started a sale yard for general produce, which he developed and enlarged until it occupied from the Exeter Hotel in Rundle Street to East Terrace and along to North Terrace. He sold it to a company in 1876 for £23,000. The market gardeners and some Adelaide citizens presented him with a gold watch and a purse of gold sovereigns in appreciation of his work in establishing the market. Upon his retirement as manager of the market, a banquet was given in his honour, when an address and a silver epergne were given to him. I thought he would have got quite a lot out of this for himself without all the trappings. In 1877, 6 and 7, Vaughan had the Botanic Hotel and the Botanic Chambers built on the corner of East and North Terraces. The South Australian Register of the 13th of August 1877 described the complex as a large family hotel, 3 shops and 7 dwelling houses, which when completed will form one of the handsomest terraces in Adelaide. The buildings are uniform in style and both substantial and rich in appearance. Then they added the balconies. Looks quite different, doesn't it? Hereby hangs a tale. This lady's name was Mary E. Fairbairn. And though she was an abortionist, Fairbairn was not a terribly good name for her, I guess, so she was known as Madam Melissa Harper. In 1892 to 1895, she lived at 106 North Terrace, thank goodness not the 126, near the corner of Frome Street, then Tavistock Street, next to Dr. Fisher's building. When one of her patients died, she was charged with murder but found guilty of manslaughter and given 3 years' jail with hard labour. At this time she was living in one of the Botanic Chambers. So many people have lived in the Botanic Chambers over the years, doctors, lawyers, dressmakers, and Fred Frost the butcher. About him I know nothing, but I do know about the rabbi who lived there. Last slide, I promise. The rabbi was Abraham Tobias Boas. He was born in Amsterdam and had a wide education in Holland. He went to England to learn English and to prepare for the ministry. Imagine having to prepare for the ministry in another language. He was 28 years old when he arrived in Adelaide to lead the Hebrew congregation in 1870. At this time, the synagogue was still a quaint oriental-looking building with strange diamond-paned windows, and it was set well back on the block in Rundle Street East. The following week, in the Observer, there was a notice that said, "Mr. Boas is a young man of promise. He has a clear, firm voice, an impressive yet pleasing manner, and is likely to exercise a beneficial influence upon his charge." The Reverend Boas lived in the Botanic Chambers, which was conveniently close to the synagogue. He was their first rabbi. To go back just for a moment, 2 brothers named Solomon had been transported in 1818 from London. When they'd served there 7 years in Sydney, they set up in business, buying shipments of goods and selling them at auction. In 1838, Emmanuel Solomon came to South Australia as a wealthy merchant. It was his family who were instrumental in having the first little synagogue built and leading the worship. So they hadn't actually had a rabbi up till this time. 3 years after he came to Adelaide, the Reverend Boas married Elizabeth Solomon. They had 10 children in the next 15 years. The new synagogue was built in front of the old one the year after Reverend Boas arrived. The land had been donated to the Hebrew community, and they wanted to sell the frontage to on Rundle Street during the land boom, but this needed an act of Parliament. The boom subsided and they were too late, so they built 5 shops along the Rundle Street frontage and moved the main entrance to Synagogue Place. This gave them an income. 25 years later, the Observer said of Reverend Boas, "He had the affectionate esteem of Jew and Christian alike, and was well known and respected in many circles, religious, secular and literary. A man of scholarly achievements, he once gave a lecture on that much misunderstood character Shylock, concluding that the moneylender of Verona had been much maligned." The Botanic Hotel had such a commanding presence on the corner of North and East Terraces that the Botanic Chambers to the west are somewhat dwarfed by it. If you wondered how Rabbi Boas fitted that large family into one of the terrace houses, it may be of interest to give you what the South Australian Register description was in August 1877 when they were newly finished. The new buildings near Botanical Gardens, it goes on about the hotel, then. There are also 7 private houses. Each has 2 fine large rooms, including a bathroom, and is fitted with every convenience. The ceilings throughout are 12 feet high. Each house has a bay window on the ground floor. The cornices are ornamented in classical style. The entrance hall is 6 feet wide. The drawing room on the first floor, which goes over the entrance hall and the parlour, is a spacious room, 35 feet by 18. We don't get one of those too often, do we? And leads out onto a balcony. These houses overlook the Botanical Gardens and the Adelaide Hospital Gardens. In the last century, without the cars and the buses and the trucks, it must have been a lovely place to live. Thank you.
Yes, the Voss House. And John Martin's was behind Dr. Voss's house, but next to Dr. Voss's house was a sort of a low single-storey building, and it was like the Lyceum Club had their first meeting rooms, or early meeting rooms there, and it was nice and open. They had cane chairs and nice windows, and it was really a very pleasant little, looked like a cafe, but it was a private club room. And so that was right on North Terrace, and I don't remember what it belonged to before, whether it was built as that or whether it was somebody's house, but it was a most open plan, which was very unusual in those other houses that were there. So whether it was first purpose built.
I don't remember the Lyceum Club being there, but I do remember the English-speaking union, what was the other one? There were a lot along there, weren't there? I was just trying to think. Yes, that was the Victoria League was back. Oh, it's funny, I just can't remember the name of that other club. Do you remember Raymond? Yes, that was there too. The Royal Commonwealth Club was there, was it? I just can't remember the name of the other one. That was. I'll think of it directly when I don't need to. Yes. Oh, do tell us about it. No, and the block that I showed you that had all the little buildings all haphazardly stacked all over it, those cottages, that has had a very checkered career, and that's been a bowling alley and an outdoor picture show and all sorts of things in its time. A car park, yeah. No, the Palais is where it was. Palais parking is where the Palais Royal was, and the Palais Royal was on Henry Eyre's horse paddock, where he used to stable his horses, or have his horses out in the paddock. The stables were on the next block along. He had 2 acres of North Terrace. No, the governor's still with us. The governor. No, I'm being facetious, sorry. Well, that's the only freestanding house, I think. Next door is the pair of houses that Dr. Fisher built, and there's a doctor in one side of that and a beautician in the other, and a dentist at the back. And then, of course, down in the Botanic Chambers there are quite a lot of people living, but unfortunately a few years ago somebody bought the lot and then strata titled each one of those houses, so they made 4 out of each one, so that to get one complete house now you'd have to buy 4 strata titles, which would be hard, I think. Oh, is this the one in the corner of the 2-storey one that was part of the row houses, 3 houses? I'm sorry. Right, yes. I don't think it's been a residence for quite a while. It was a sort of a bit of a flop house a while ago. I investigated it and came out quickly. It looked like, I saw the builder's room and I thought, this looks interesting, I must check. And when I went in, I was surprised at what it was like. But I think they've done a lot of work on that and made it quite presentable now.
I came across an article in the, I shouldn't really say this for a historian, but I did read the Adelaide Truth recently. tells the truth. I came across an article, it was headline news, of what Lewis did at the South Australian. Some of you might remember, either in the late 1940s or early 1950s, they had a reenactment of one of the great expeditions, and it was to end at the South Australian. Well, when the people who were involved in the trek came back to the South Australian, where the governor was waiting, Lewis wouldn't let them through the door because they were not appropriately dressed. And then just a little bit more about, for those of you who don't know, Rosemary mentioned perhaps that William McMinn, who was the designer of the Michell building, perhaps he had a little help. Well, what Rosemary hadn't said was that William McMinn, in actual fact, plagiarised the plans. In a court of law today, he would have probably been given the thumbs down. The Michell building, originally there was a design competition, and the design competition was actually won by a Melbourne architect called Michael Egan, who is the designer of the Torrens building. The committee of the University of Adelaide said, "We can't afford to build your plans," which at that time was to cost no more than £11,000. So they scrapped the whole idea. William McMinn then said, leave it to me, I will come up with something cheaper. So what he did, he came up with the designs of the what is now the Michell building, and although it was half the size of the original intention, it cost £30,000 or so. So just to let you know.
When I was doing my research on the Botanic Gardens, I was told by someone that the people who I suspect were the Hansons, the children living in the Royal Adelaide Hospital building, were allowed to, during about, I suspect, the 1880s, were allowed to when their pets died, they were allowed to bury them at the Botanic Gardens with a suitable little ceremony for canaries and, I presume, kittens or whatever. And they were allowed by the gardeners to have a little ceremony in the Botanic Gardens to bury the pets. I thought that was rather nice.
Well, I think that's a good place to bring this part of proceedings to a close. Normally I ask Hamish, as Vice President, to say a few words of thanks. If he doesn't mind, I'll say a few things myself. Because Rosemary, I've sat there for, an hour and a half, and been absolutely charmed. Rosemary's reminded me of everything that I've found fascinating about Adelaide for 20 years that I've been here, and everything that I've found frustrating about it. I feel as though I've actually been for a walk down turn of the century North Terrace. It's a really nice idea to do it this way and not to be depressed, as I've been on many walking tours, to see what little is left of South Australia. I think she's overwhelmed us with information, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, but in a very positive sense. And an enormous quantity of research has clearly gone into her work. I think I can always tell when people in the back are reminiscing, thinking, being reminded, and it's always a sign of a successful talk when it's jogging people's memories. And I think this is probably one of the finest examples I've heard of that in all the years I've been here as President. Actually, that makes me sound terribly ancient, doesn't it? But still. Just an enormous amount of information, for just about all of us. She's pleased everybody. Two of my undertakers, you've mentioned, Dr. Lam Yao, who's probably got the biggest memorial in West Terrace Cemetery, and I heard lots of other people mentally making associations with their own research, with their own family connections, with their own reminiscences of childhood, and so it goes on. I don't want to be giving a speech of my own, but I really do think that this has been one of the highlights of my time as President of the Historical Society of South Australia. It really is, in a way, frustrating in the end, though, because it shows how close Adelaide came to being what it should have been, which was a really distinctive colonial city in Australia, the Charleston of the Southern Hemisphere. It got within about a decade, I reckon, another decade, and it would have survived, and people wouldn't have knocked all of those buildings down. I've said enough. I'm sure you'll want to join with me in thanking Rosemary for a magnificent evening.